Welcome to Geology Lecture. This is Professor Diana L. Pomeroy, and this week we'll learn about dinosaur paleontology. Paleontologists are geologists who study ancient life on Earth as preserved in the fossil record, and dinosaur paleontologists specialize in these creatures. Everything we know about dinosaurs is contained in their bones and traces that are preserved through the rare process of fossilization. Most dinosaur specimens that are recovered are incomplete, and our knowledge of dinosaurs continues to change over time as more specimens are unearthed and studied. When we think of dinosaurs, we often think about the Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movies. For many of us, our ideas about dinosaurs are reinforced by popular media rather than fueled by the scientific research behind the media we consume. Ironically, the same form of media is what keeps the interest in dinosaurs going, and the study of dinosaurs is often considered a gateway into other branches of science. Dinosaurs were established as a unique group of reptiles in 1842 by Sir Richard Owen, who was the curator of the Natural History Museum of London. Dinosaur skeletons and trackways had been excavated and studied by indigenous tribes and people of many cultures for thousands of years prior to this time, and were integrated into many stories and cultural traditions. On this slide, we have some images of some cultural traditions that are still in use today that involve dinosaurs indirectly. So the first image on the left, upper left, we've got the Hopi people. They perform a ritual known as the snake dance, and you'll note that on their dress they have these tridactyl patterns which resemble dinosaur footprints. And it's believed that trackways of dinosaurs were part of this ceremony. On the right, we have an illustration of one of the Chinese deities that's known as the vermilion bird. Footprints from dinosaur tracks were thought to be bird footprints for a long time, not just in Chinese culture or in indigenous Native American culture, but in many cultures and groups of people. They saw bird trackways and they assumed that they were giant birds rather than dinosaurs, and as we'll see, they're both right. So we'll get into that later. Finally, on this slide, I have something that may be considered a little controversial in some cases, but what's used as a form of medicine are dinosaur bones. They're referred to as dragon bones in Chinese culture, and so for a long time, for thousands of years, people would find these remnants of dinosaur bones in farming communities, and they would take these bones and grind them into a powder and into a paste. And so people would actually eat dinosaur bones and use that as a form of medicine. And it's still being used in some traditions in China today as a means of healing, but again, those are actual dinosaur bones that were used for that purpose. So dinosaur bones and trackways, they've been present uh, not only for millions of years, but in human society as well for thousands of years. And really, it wasn't until the 1800s that when the scientific community began to be established for paleontology and geology, that dinosaur bones became a source of intrigue and study. And so dinosaur bones, in addition to other large prehistoric reptile bones, were collected and studied by various UK academic scientists in the 1800s. And some of these scientists include Mary Anning, Gideon Mantell, and William Buckland. Some of the first dinosaurs to be unearthed and grouped together as such after Richard Owen grouped them as dinosaurs include the ones that are featured on this slide. These are all statues that can be found in the Crystal Palace Park in London today, and they were first sculpted by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins in the 1800s. So that's how old these statues are. And so each of these represents the most scientifically accurate depiction of the dinosaurs from that time. And so we've got on the left, we have Iguanodon. In the upper left and the upper right, we have Megalosaurus. In the lower two images, we've got Hylaeosaurus. So all of these dinosaurs were grouped together as dinosaurs based on their bones at that time. So if you'd like to learn more about the Crystal Palace dinosaurs that you can see on this slide, I highly recommend that you check out Darren Naish's YouTube channel, which is in my featured channels here on YouTube. And also feel free to check out his podcast called the Tetsu Podcast. All kinds of interesting information there besides dinosaurs. But he talks at length about the Crystal Palace dinosaurs and why they're so important for the understanding of paleontology and incorporating artistic interpretation of what these animals were like, right? And so that understanding again is something that he discusses at length. So if you'd like to learn more about these particular portrayals, go ahead and check out his channel. So this slide shows what scientists interpret those same dinosaurs, Iguanodon, Megalosaurus, and Hylaeosaurus, to look like now. The first dinosaurs to be unearthed in the United States. So those include Astrodon, Hadrosaurus, and Dryptosaurus. And so those dinosaurs, they were actually found on the East Coast. And today we're probably more familiar with dinosaurs from West Coast discoveries and excavations, but some of the very first dinosaurs that we've unearthed here actually belong to the East Coast. Now they were found by groups of workers that worked in mines, iron mines, coal mines, and also on the railroad. At this time, during the 1800s, there was a push for the Transcontinental Railroad, and so railroad workers and farmers as well, they would excavate specimens all the time. And so here on the upper left, we have an image of some black iron miners, and it's this group of individuals that helped to discover specimens like Astrodon in Maryland. So absolutely amazing that, again, we just find specimens by chance, by random chance, and by the hard work of these people. They worked very hard to excavate and put together the railroad and to put, to excavate for iron and coal, which are essential products that we still use today for a source of fuel and energy. And again, without that excavation process, we wouldn't have that dinosaur. We wouldn't have Astrodon. And similarly, where Hadrosaurus was found in New Jersey, that was pretty much on accident. The marl pit in which it was found, the materials were being excavated for something else. A forest was being cleared, and they came across these giant bones of a dinosaur. So Hadrosaurus was one of the first dinosaurs that we found on U.S. soil, and it's in New Jersey. And dinosaur finds continued throughout the 1800s. Later on in the 1800s, 1860s, 1880s, there was a period of time in the US that's been referred to in dinosaur paleontology as the Bone Wars. And this occurred between really among three paleontologists, but the emphasis is on the two paleontologists on the lower left, and those are Othniel Charles Marsh, O.C. Marsh, and Edward Drinker Cope, E.D. Cope. And unfortunately, both of these paleontologists had a severe feud for most of their adult lives. They pretty much hated each other. And I will post another video about them because they lead some very interesting lives beyond that feud known as the Bone Wars. So these men excavated dinosaurs, again, with teams of people, for the better part of at least 2 or 3 decades, and their excavations gave us all kinds of dinosaurs that we're familiar with today. Things like Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, those dinosaurs are from their work. In addition to this person on the right, which is very rarely referenced when we talk about the Bone Wars, but he's no less important, this person here is Joseph Leidy. Now, Joseph Leidy, it was really due to him that Edward Drinker Cope had risen to the power that he had to fight against Marsh, and so without Leidy's influence, Cope would not be, being a part of that excavation expedition. And so those three people in the 1800s were really influential in pushing this idea of paleontology being a westward expansion type of scenario. So it's interesting because historically there was the westward expansion that was going on with the development again of the Transcontinental Railroad, and with that there was also this push for excavating fossils with the fiery rampage between Marsh and Cope that went on for some time. And so all of this kind of brought paleontology to the forefront in the United States, and really it's from all of their work that more specimens began to be uncovered. And so this slide shows the mounted skeletons and or models of the first United States dinosaurs that I listed on the previous slide. So those are Astrodon on the upper left, Hadrosaurus on the lower middle, and then we have Dryptosaurus on the right. Now this Dryptosaurus, by the way, was made famous in a painting by Charles R. Knight. So that, again, depiction of dinosaurs jumping in midair and being active, that was something new. And keep in mind that in the 1800s, we still were entrenched in this idea that dinosaurs were essentially giant reptiles, giant lizards. And it wasn't until a few hundred years later that the idea began to be turned on its head. So in the 1900s, so now we're moving forward past the Bone Wars, now we're getting into 19-teens, 1920s, and moving forward from there into the more modern age. So the 1900s dinosaur expeditions, they flourished, and many major natural history museums, what's shown here is the American Museum of Natural History in New York. A lot of major natural history museums began to be established during this time. And one of the major expeditions from the American Museum at that time was the Roy Chapman Andrews field expedition to Mongolia. There were a lot of expeditions that were going on during this time, but that was one of the major ones because it was one of the first times that the United States and Mongolia began to interact in terms of a scientific study. And it's very interesting how things have since changed over time with politics and dinosaurs all being mixed up together. But really, our ideas about dinosaurs as creatures didn't begin to change until the 1960s. And that was primarily due to the work of a dinosaur paleontologist named John Ostrom. He revolutionized the idea of what dinosaurs were like in revealing that creatures like Deinonychus, which is a Maniraptoran dinosaur, so think of the velociraptors from Jurassic Park, another example, so dinosaurs like that. He stated in his work and his study that based on the skeletal characteristics of Deinonychus, that these had to be somehow connected to birds, that these were the ancestors of birds of today based on particular skeletal characteristics, and also there were implications for behavior and metabolism present in studying these bones. Now, Ostrom's work was furthered by a scientist that is pictured on this slide, and his name is Robert T. Wacker. His work continued from what Ostrom had started, and this idea that dinosaurs were not large, sluggish lizards, that they were very bird-like, they had a high metabolism, that they themselves are birds. This idea revolutionized the way that dinosaur paleontology was done and looked at. Now, that's not to say that there was resistance, that there wasn't any resistance in this idea. There was, and there still is, unfortunately, in some cases. But there's this concept, again, that dinosaurs are very bird-like. They are birds, that the birds evolved from dinosaurs. And it's through their work that we understand this concept today, through their study. And so this dinosaur renaissance allowed for people to get more involved in dinosaur paleontology than ever before. And so in the 80s and 90s, there was a surge of new dinosaur discoveries, and they were headed by a few other paleontologists that are featured on this slide. Their names are Jack Horner, Jim Kirkland, and Karen Chin. And really, it's their work, in addition to many other paleontologists' work at this time, the 80s and 90s, throughout this dinosaur renaissance, that we began to recognize dinosaurs as not only more bird-like, but as a distinct species that was worth studying and getting into. So during the 80s and 90s, there was this dinomania that took hold of the general public and within science itself. And so during this time, hundreds of new dinosaurs began to be documented and described, and they still continue. So this thus began essentially the golden age of dinosaur discovery. So dinosaur finds that were discovered by the scientists in the previous slide. Here's some examples of their contributions. So on the upper left, we have Utah raptor. On the upper right, we have the famous fighting dinosaur specimens. There's Velociraptor on the top and Protoceratops on the bottom left in that image. On the lower left, we have actually a sauropod dinosaur, coprolite. Coprolite is poop. Okay, so that's what we're looking at in that image. And on the right, lower right, we've got Maiasaura with its nests. So again, during this time in 1980s, 1990s, paleontologists not only began to think of dinosaurs differently in terms of their metabolism and behavior, but also we began to get evidence for these processes, evidence for changes in very bird-like behavior with certain nesting techniques and with studying minute things like burrows and poop and trackways. All of this data was starting to be taken together and created a picture of a very dynamic world that these creatures lived in and survived through over millions of years. So suffice it to say that it takes all kinds of work and individuals to put together museum exhibits and to preserve dinosaur fossils and to present this information to the general public. So artists, writers, architects, even those in business can succeed as paleontologists, and all of the people that you see on this slide, their work has truly advanced dinosaur study into the 21st century. So our understanding of dinosaur paleontology is still changing. Our understanding of dinosaurs as creatures is still changing as well. And more than ever before, inclusivity, diversity in paleontology is becoming part of the forefront of these changes. And so hopefully in the future we will see more outstanding things from the individual shown on the slide and from many more that were not included in these pictures. All kinds of dinosaur paleontologists, again, their work is essential in understanding this major era of geologic time, the Mesozoic era. And so dinosaur skeletons, they tell us which group or family they belong to. So dinosaur skeletons themselves, the bone tissue, the trackways, recall that there's different types of fossilization. In my geologic time lecture that I've got posted on YouTube, in the Earth Science and Geology playlist, you will find out more about different types of fossilization. And so what's shown here on the slide are some skeletal mounts, which are replicas of body fossils that are found in situ, which means that they're found as like whole chunks of bone and these have been essentially cobbled together to create these mounds that you see on the slide. So body fossils are the skeletal tissue, so limb elements, vertebrae, skull, things like that. So dinosaurs have a unique way in which their bones are put together. So this tells us a lot about several things. It tells us a lot about their taxonomy, which involves the naming of different species. In my oceanography playlist, I have a video that goes over taxonomy, biological classification. I do recommend that you check out that video as well to help you with some of these concepts. Dinosaurs also have differences in their diet, their behavior, and all of this can go back to how they were fossilized, where they were fossilized, what level of preservation was involved. So dinosaur skeletons are all that we have. Dinosaur paleontologists are very much like detectives working on a cold case that's millions of years old. We don't know everything that there is to know. We just know from the evidence that's given to us at the time. And the more evidence that we can collect to show what's happening, the better that the case becomes and the clearer the picture is as well as to the environment that these animals lived in, their role in the ecosystem, and again, what these animals were truly like. So the study of dinosaur fossils typically involves a process that's known as fieldwork. Now there's different types of dinosaur paleontology. You can be a person that gets into fieldwork, the traditional sense, where you go out to a desert environment. Why a desert environment? Because the layers of sediment have been uplifted, eroded, and exposed. And so this makes them more accessible than what we have, say, in a city or a suburb where there's plants everywhere, asphalt covering sections, buildings that have, possibly even taken from that sediment and used it. But those materials, again, the sediments themselves are out in the open. They're easily exposed, readily accessible, and the fossils themselves are exposed from distinct time frames and different formations. And so dinosaur fieldwork is a long process. It usually takes multiple summers. It's done in the summers because in the desert, yes, summers are brutal, but it's better to go in early summer into a desert environment to excavate than it is, say, in the dead of winter. So, although with the bone wars, that process did happen where they excavate in winter, but that's for another PowerPoint I'm going to share with you later. So this process of fieldwork includes several steps. The first is not only finding an area to excavate, which is usually given by permission. So permits are often acquired through the Bureau of Land Management or through tribal councils, or both. And once the permits are acquired by an institution, then the area is mapped. It's plotted out on a geologic map, and it's determined based on other field sites where the field site can be located. And the entire area, once you get to that site, the entire area is also mapped out further using a grid system. So on the image on the lower right, we have this grid system that's being excavated through. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a series of flags that are placed on a stretchable grid made with usually tape or rope, and this grid is then placed over a particular area and excavation begins. Now the reason why areas are mapped out like this is to record changes to the environment in which the fossils were once in place. It gives us a sense of what the environment was like when the animal was deposited in the area and then fossilized, better sense of what the environment was actually like when that animal was alive. And so mapping is very important in understanding the locality of where those dinosaurs are discovered. After that, after site is secured and excavation will then begin, again, usually after permits are acquired and everything else is clear and good to go. Excavation itself is a long, laborious process. It takes months to years depending on the particular site. So specimens are excavated, they're pulled out of the ground, and as they're being pulled out of the ground, they are then protected by layers of glue first, and then surrounded by a plaster jacket. So, to learn more about the process of excavation, I strongly recommend that you check out the PBS series Prehistoric Road Trip. They go way more in depth than I can in the slide that only takes a couple of minutes about the process of excavation, and it shows how this process actually works, and it's kind of cool. I really enjoy the series, and I strongly recommend it to you. Fossil preservation is the next step. So after specimens are excavated, they're wrapped in plaster jackets. They're usually then taken back to a laboratory setting where those jackets are then opened and the specimen is further prepared, which means that the bone tissue is separated from the surrounding sediment. And again, this process is also very time consuming. It can take months to years depending on the type of sediment that's surrounding the specimen, how durable the bone tissue is. Often, unfortunately, once specimens are exposed to the oxygen in the air, that's hundreds of millions of years later, the bone's tissue will begin to degrade, and this is why glue is so important in this process. It helps to preserve and protect the specimen as it's being excavated. So uh, and prepared out of the sediment. So after all that process, after preparation and fieldwork is done, that is when research on the fossils will begin. So it takes a team of people to excavate these fossils. So it takes teams of people that work together to find the fossils, and you can see that here on this slide. So some fieldwork tools that are used, fieldwork in essence has not changed in over 100 years. So some fieldwork tools that we use include things like shovels and picks, various types of hammers, geologic hammers, rock hammers, sledgehammers, chisels and picks, dental tools, brushes, glue, and then of course there's the gear that we wear, right, to protect us from the sun and from the elements. And so all of these tools are critical in doing fieldwork. So fieldwork again is hard labor. That is the actual excavation and preparation of specimens on site, and then eventually that preparation will continue in a laboratory setting. And once the preparation is complete, then specimens can be studied. So again, the first route of dinosaur paleontology involves more of a fieldwork aspect. But then there are other aspects to dinosaur paleontology that don't necessarily involve that process. There are other aspects where museum collections are studied instead and or in addition to that fieldwork. And so when fossils are sent to an institutional lab where the specimens are then prepared, and they're studied over months and years, so that research process can happen not only in the field but also behind the scenes in various laboratory prep settings, whether the specimens are in cabinets or in collections, or whether the specimens are on site. Dinosaur specimens are studied and written about. So it takes, again, months to years to not only excavate dinosaurs, but also to study them and to produce quality research on these organisms, describing them, describing changes to their size and shape over time, describing measurements, describing where these creatures fit in the tree of life. And so that research that's conducted is then eventually presented at various meetings through poster presentations and also through technical discussions. So some of this research is eventually published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. To find out more about the scientific method and process, I strongly recommend that you check out the first video in my Earth Science and Geology playlist here on YouTube. And this slide shows various paleontologists proudly presenting their work at the last SBP meeting that I attended, which was in 2018. So most dinosaur fossils that we're familiar with, like Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops, those come from Western North America. So again, from what I was discussing earlier, in the 1800s there was this push westward, and so dinosaur fossil hunting also was pushed westward. And in fact, the vast majority of dinosaur specimens that we have recovered in North America are situated more towards the western United States and parts of Canada. And so keep in mind, though, that there are many more dinosaurs from dozens of other localities around the world, and dinosaurs were found in all three periods in the Mesozoic era, starting from around 200 million years ago and lasting actually until the present day. But non-avian dinosaurs like the ones you see on this slide, those dinosaurs are found in the Cretaceous period. In fact, most dinosaur specimens that we uncover are from the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods of time, especially the ones that we find in the western United States. Dinosaurs are archosaurs, a group of terrestrial vertebrates. Those are land-based animals with a backbone that includes crocodiles and then descendants of the dinosaurs today, which are birds. During the time of the dinosaurs, so during the Mesozoic era is sometimes referred to as the age of reptiles, because it's during this time frame that the dominant life forms that we find in the fossil record are reptiles. So reptiles essentially took over the ecological niches of other creatures from past time periods. So we had reptiles that lived in the ocean, there were reptiles that flew in the air, there were reptiles that lived on the land. So reptiles dominated this era of time. The reptiles that are shown in this slide are often confused with dinosaurs, but they themselves are not dinosaurs. So we have pterosaurs in the upper left, and then we have some marine reptiles, mosasaurs on the right, and then a plesiosaur on the lower left. And so none of these creatures on this slide are considered dinosaurs. Yet they're contemporaneous. They lived alongside the dinosaurs hundreds of millions of years ago. So dinosaurs are strictly terrestrial animals. They are land-based vertebrate animals. Dinosaurs are divided into two major groups, and those are the Saurischians, or lizard hips, and the Ornithischians, or the bird hips. Dinosaurs are grouped this way based on differences in their anatomy, specifically their hip structure. So this naming system has stuck for hundreds of years. There was a challenge to this taxonomy about 5 or 6 years ago, but according to the data that we have, this tree still is the simplest explanation that we have for how dinosaurs are related to one another. So that's what cladograms do. Cladograms are like evolutionary family trees. They're diagrams that show the evolutionary relationships between each of these major groups or categories of dinosaurs. It also shows how all dinosaurs have a common ancestor, which again is an archosaur. So dinosaurs, again, split off into these two groups. We've got Saurischians on the left, and we have Ornithischians on the right. So Saurischia means lizard hip, and Ornithischia means bird hip. And again, these dinosaur groups are named based on that hip structure, based on the positioning of the pelvic bones relative to the hip socket. So lizard hips have a distinctly different look with their pelvis rather than the bird hips, and that's why these dinosaurs are grouped in this way. And again, this naming convention has stuck for hundreds of years. So here we have the Saurischia, which are the lizard hips. And within the Saurischia, there are two major groups. These are the Sauropoda and Theropoda, or sauropods and theropods. Theropods were carnivorous, and sauropods were herbivorous. Included within the theropod dinosaur group are birds. So an example of a sauropod dinosaur is a Diplodocus. So this is a cast of the dinosaur Diplodocus. This particular Diplodocus is very famous. This is Dippy, that is on display at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And so here we have, again, an example of a sauropod dinosaur. And here's a statue of that same creature. So here's a statue of what that Diplodocus would have looked like in life. Another name for sauropod dinosaurs, if it's easier for you to remember, is think of the Land Before Time. So Littlefoot, the main character from Land Before Time, is an example of a type of sauropod dinosaur, a long-necked dinosaur. And often the name long neck is what comes to mind when we think of these creatures. Diplodocus was also featured in Jurassic World. An example of a theropod dinosaur is Velociraptor. So this cast of a Velociraptor specimen, which comes from Mongolia, this cast is on display at the Natural History Museum of LA County. And here we have a more realistic model of what Velociraptor may have looked like in life. This is a model that I painted. So this model comes from the Creative Beast Studios, from David Silva's studios, Beasts of the Mesozoic Raptor line. And so again, this is what Velociraptor would have looked like in life. So here we have the Ornithischia. So this is the other group of dinosaurs. These are the bird-hip dinosaurs. Within Ornithischia, there are three main groups. Those are Theriophora, which are otherwise known as armored dinosaurs. Ornithopoda, which are the hadrosaurs included in this group. And Ceratopsia, which includes ceratopsian dinosaurs. I've simplified Marginocephalia into Ceratopsia for this class. So all of the dinosaurs on this side of the cladogram, all of these creatures are herbivorous. Thyreophoran or armored dinosaurs include creatures like Stegosaurus, which is on the upper part of the slide, and a relative of Ankylosaurus known as Borealopelta on the bottom of the slide. Ornithopod dinosaurs include hadrosaurs within this group. So here we have the upper portion, we've got the hadrosaur dinosaur Parasaurolophus, and on the lower portion we have the dinosaur Corythosaurus. Their skeletal structures and what they would have looked like in life. Finally, rounding out the Ornithischian group, we have ceratopsian dinosaurs, and this includes the dinosaur Triceratops, which is shown on this slide. So dinosaurs eventually filled every ecological niche on land for nearly 200 million years after the Permian major mass extinction event. So recall from the Geologic time lecture that with the Permian major mass extinction, about 90% of all life on Earth went extinct, and from that small 10% handful of creatures that made it past that boundary point, dinosaurs evolved from a lineage in that group. And so here we have a beautiful painting by James Gurney, and we've got some dinosaurs standing around in a forest environment. And so dinosaurs were incredible as a group because they lived in all kinds of habitats and environments, and we have evidence of, again, changes to these environments through study of not only the fossils themselves, but of the sediments and of, again, just immense changes what these creatures went through. So they survived that major mass extinction event, but unfortunately they faced another mass extinction hundreds of millions of years later. Yet they're still with us today. So dinosaurs are not necessarily a symbol of extinction, but really more of a symbol of resilience, if anything. So throughout the Mesozoic era, the supercontinent of Pangaea split apart into two continents. So in the north, there was the continent known as Laurasia, and in the south, there was the continent of Gondwana. Now these supercontinents gradually drifted apart from each other over time, and eventually they split into the continents that we have today by the end of the Mesozoic. So dinosaurs first evolved as a distinct group of archosaur reptiles at the end of the Triassic period. What made dinosaurs different than other reptiles is their hip structure. So not only do we classify dinosaur hips whether they're Saurischia or Ornithischia, but also the very hip structure and leg structure of dinosaurs themselves is unique. Dinosaurs have a hollowed out hip socket. This allows for them to hold their limbs underneath their bodies, and this gave them an advantage in terms of evolving and surviving over, the millennia, over millions of years. And so dinosaurs again first evolved towards the end of the Triassic period, and the remains have been found on every continent due to the drift and breaking apart of Pangaea over time. The Triassic period maintained a fairly warm and dry climate throughout, and eventually that led into the warmer, higher sea dominated Jurassic period. So during the Jurassic period, sea level rose, and all of the major dinosaur lineage that we discussed on previous slides, all of those diversified into a myriad of hundreds of species that we can find in the fossil record. And so here we have changes to the land surface, and note that sea level is rising throughout much of the Jurassic. Note that most of Gondwana still remains connected together. So the Cretaceous period experienced a rise and then drop in sea level. So here we have the beginning of the Cretaceous period, and then we get into the middle of the Cretaceous. In the middle of the Cretaceous, there was a seaway that developed in the middle of North America. So we've got the Western Interior Seaway that had formed during the Cretaceous period, and then towards the end of the Cretaceous, that's when the sea level began to drop, continents continued to drift, and it's during this time that several things had gone on. First of all, what's interesting is that throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods of time, dinosaur diversity really began to peak, really began to reach its peak right before the very end of the Cretaceous. So dinosaur diversity didn't really drop off as is previously thought. So really, dinosaurs were, again, all over the continents. They were still present up until the very end of the Cretaceous period. And that ended with a bang in the literal sense. So what exactly caused this extinction event? So the dinosaur extinction is technically referred to as the Cretaceous Paleogene or the Cretaceous Tertiary KPG extinction event, or KT extinction event. So what caused that event? Well, it remains a mystery as to exactly why this event was so selective. There were particular groups of organisms, including dinosaurs, in terms of non-avian dinosaurs. Most of the dinosaurs that we're familiar with, things like sauropods and stegosaurs and ankylosaurs and uh, tyrannosaurs, triceratops, all those dinosaurs are extinct, okay? They're not with us anymore, although they remain with us today in the form of birds. We'll get to that in a little bit. But why exactly this event was so selective remains unknown. So it's kind of a mystery, but recent studies indicate that we had a major asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula that definitely threw off the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere for at least a few million years, and the eruption of a series of volcanoes that had gone on for hundreds of millions of years in what's now India in the Deccan Traps. These events taken together are pretty much what sealed the fate of many species at the end of the Cretaceous period, including most dinosaurs. So for more information about this asteroid impact event, which you can see here on the slide for scale, so here is the asteroid impact hitting near where the Yucatan Peninsula is today, and then we've got the aftermath in the lower right. If you'd like to know more about this event, I recommend that you read the book T-Rex and the Crater of Doom by Walter Alvarez, who was one of the principal scientists that was involved in that study of that asteroid impact extinction. And so again, this idea of asteroid impact killing the dinosaurs is fairly recent. I mean, we didn't really understand asteroid impact with this extinction event really until the 80s and 90s, and this idea is still considered controversial in some scientific circles today. So what we know though is the majority of dinosaurs are extinct, but not all of them are. Dinosaurs did not entirely disappear after the Mesozoic era ended. There are more than 10,000 species of birds alive today, and each species of bird is the last living branch of the Dinosauria. So on this slide, we have some photographs of birds that I've taken over the past couple of years. And again, these are all birds that you find in your neighborhood. We've got a hummingbird and ducks and pigeon. We've got an egret here, or maybe a heron, depending on where you're living. And so all of these species of birds that are around us, everyday birds that we encounter, those are dinosaurs. And how do we know this information? Again, starting with the work of John Ostrom and continuing on until today, studies of dinosaur bones and dinosaur tissue tell us that the metabolism of these creatures, the similarity of the bone structure, all of these things indicate that yes, birds are the living descendants of dinosaurs. So for more information about dinosaur paleontology and how to get involved, and about dinosaurs in general, I encourage you to check out your local natural history museum, either online or in person. I think that it's the best way to become part of the dinosaur paleo community. So here are a few museums in California that focus on dinosaurs. Feel free to Google each of these, and again, feel free to stop by as well when you can. I hope that you enjoyed this video on dinosaur paleontology, and thanks for watching.